While the wars of the 1860s had been initially a drain on the finite resources of the fledgling colony, some prominent New Zealanders profited handsomely from the outcome. The most notable of these was Thomas Russell, an Auckland lawyer and businessman who was Minister of Defence in two ministries between 1862 and 1864, and law partner of Frederick Whitaker, who led one of them. Footnote: all four Russell brothers became successful lawyers, and all four founded law firms that survived, with appropriate name changes, into the 21st century. Thomas Russell's firm became Bellgully Buddle Weir. Returning to the text. Russell, who was in his early 30s when he held the portfolio, has been described by business historian Russell Stone as arguably the outstanding commercial figure in 19th century New Zealand. A tall, dark, energetic, intelligent and masterful man, Russell accumulated a considerable fortune in his 20s through both his law practice and his speculative business activities. Among the latter was his close involvement in the foundation of the New Zealand Insurance Company in 1859, of the Bank of New Zealand, which took over much government business in 1861, and a little later the New Zealand Loan and Mercantile Company. As Minister of Defence, Russell eagerly prosecuted the Waikato War in order to put Maori in what he regarded as their place, and to open up the Waikato itself to property investment and settlement. In these aims, he and his ministerial colleagues fell out with Grey, who believed, correctly, that the post-war confiscation policy was being applied to the most desirable land without any consideration as to which tribes had fought or not fought against the Crown. Russell profited spectacularly from the war's aftermath when he was out of politics, particularly by persuading the government in 1873 to sell the enormous Piako swamp to a syndicate of which he was the leading member. This and a number of lucrative government commissions led the Canterbury politician, William Rolleston, to ask whether Russell is not the representative of the colonial government, but the colonial government the representative of Mr. Thomas Russell. Russell overreached himself in a complex network of investments, however. He was lucky not to lose everything he owned and came close to being indicted for fraud. His fortunes were restored by the Waihi Gold Mining Company, which went into operation at the time a new cyanide process became available for extracting gold from quartz, and brought him considerable profit. Russell and his partner Whitaker and their friend and colleague Josiah Clifton Firth were not untypical of a certain kind of businessman in the colonial era who was prepared to take enormous business and investment risks and dabble in politics to help create the kind of environment in which they and their cronies were most likely to flourish financially. And in the years preceding income tax and tighter commercial regulations, there were huge fortunes to be made. Footnote: income tax was not introduced in New Zealand until 1891 as part of the Liberal government's reform program. Up until that time, government revenue was drawn from a combination of customs and excise duties, stamp duties, property tax, land sales, and death duties. Returning to the text. The involvement of such figures in national life was inevitable, given the poor remuneration available for members of Parliament. Even though politics involved about 3 working months of the year, it was only men of private means who could afford that involvement. Not until 1879 did a working man, Samuel Andrews, a plasterer from Christchurch, win election to the House, and the rates of pay were not raised to an adequate level until 1893. The Auckland Society paper, The Observer, expressed the ideal that drove colonists such as Russell and Firth. Here, where the social disabilities, the exclusive caste, the overstrained competition, and the stereotyped conventionalism of the old world have not yet taken root, there is a clear field for men of talent, skill, and energy to climb the social ladder and to attain a degree of wealth and social elevation that is possible only to the favoured few in older countries. What could be gained spectacularly, money or reputation, could also be lost just as spectacularly. William Larnock entered Parliament a decade later than Russell and Firth, representing a Dunedin electorate. Like his predecessors, he took enormous risks that sometimes left him, as he put it, close to the edge of the ruinous cliff. He too narrowly escaped prosecution for some of his less than ethical strategies. When his fortunes were at their height in the early 1870s, he built the baronial mansion known as Larnock's Castle on the Otago Peninsula. At various times he was colonial treasurer, minister of public works and of mines. When his luck abandoned him in a bank collapse in the 1890s, and it was widely believed that his third wife was having an affair with one of his sons, her stepson, Larnock became the first and so far only MP to commit suicide in his parliamentary office. The dominant politician of the era after the New Zealand Wars, however, and the one responsible for launching the country on its most spectacular development phase, was Julius Vogel, who was Premier twice and Colonial Treasurer in 6 other ministries between 1869 and 1887. Vogel was a non-observant Jew, born in London, who came to New Zealand via Australia in 1861 to work as a journalist. That same year, he co-founded the Otago Daily Times, the first daily newspaper in the country, and eventually the longest surviving. His considerable appetite for politics and public affairs, which he initially gratified by promulgating his views and panaceas in the papers for which he wrote, led him eventually to seats on the Otago Provincial Council, and, by 1866, the National Parliament, which he entered with a strong bias in favour of the provincial system and a plan to separate the South Island administratively and financially from the North. He eventually modified these views as a result of experience in the House of Representatives, however, and while not an inspirational speaker, he proved to be a shrewd prober of the Stafford government's weaknesses, particularly its policies towards Maori. When the opposition toppled the government in 1869 and William Fox returned for the third of his 4 premierships, Vogel became treasurer. In the view of his biographer, Raywin Dalziel, he made the portfolio the most powerful post in government. He came into office at a time of economic stagnation and adopted a bold expansionist policy with plans to bring thousands of assisted immigrants to New Zealand, to construct roads, railways, bridges and telegraph lines, and to purchase more Maori land for European settlement. The plan was adopted by Parliament in 1870 and implemented over the following decade. It involved borrowing around £20 million on the London capital market to finance assisted immigration and to build 1,800 kilometres of railway, 4,000 kilometres of telegraph lines, and roads and public buildings. It was also popular throughout the country, though the government was defeated in September 1872 before the beneficial effects were apparent. A month later, Vogel was back in office in the Waterhouse Ministry, however, and the economy underwent a boom, with full employment and rising incomes up to 1874. Growth slowed in the 2 succeeding years as export prices fell. Vogel remained in office as treasurer until 1876, being premier as well from 1873 to 1875, and again for 7 months in 1876, by which time he had been knighted. Under the Vogel scheme of whole or partially paid assistance, immigrants flooded into the country, around 100,000 between 1871 and 1880. Over half came from England, about a quarter from Ireland, and slightly fewer than that from Scotland. Just under 10% were from Continental Europe, largely Germans, of whom there were more than 4,500 by 1878, building on a smaller population that had gone to Nelson in the 1840s, Scandinavians and Poles. Of the 3,294 Scandinavians, 1,938 were Danes, 667 Swedes, and 689 Norwegians. They settled mainly in the 70-mile bush area on the Wellington-Hawke's Bay boundary and left place names such as Dannevirke and Norsewood. The town of Eketahuna was once called Melamskov. Another group settled in the Manawatu. One major object of this immigration program was to restore a greater balance in the sex ratio of the New Zealand population. In 1871, New Zealand had 89,000 men and 46,000 women over the age of 20, 66 to 34%. This inequality meant that many thousands of men had no prospect of experiencing the settled existence of married family life, even if they wanted to. Many of these single men were absorbed into shearing or backcountry farm work or into milling timber, mining or public works, where they lived in camps and had little or no contact with the opposite sex. A rich male culture grew up around the lives of such men. In the Coromandel Forest, for example, gangs employed by such merchants as the Kauri Timber Company would go into virgin bush to build large shanties in the valleys in which they planned to work. These buildings, with split-paling walls and Nico-thatched roofs, would become their home for several years. They had bunks around the interior walls, a long table in the centre over an earth floor, and a kitchen and wide fireplace with a wooden or corrugated iron chimney down one end. The men worked up on the slopes felling trees and moving trunks by day, and ate, slept and took their days off in the shanties. In the evenings they read by lamplight and candles, played cards, told yarns, and sang. Because it invariably led to trouble, liquor was forbidden in most camps, as was spitting, talking about sex, and playing cards for money. Alcohol was sought in bush grog shops and in the towns between contracts or on rare holidays. When the loggers did get to town to spend their wages, like men from other isolated work sectors, they spent it on liquor, gambling, and prostitutes. Although individuals might be unpopular, there was a strong camaraderie and sense of honour among bushmen. They prided themselves on working extraordinarily hard and in not stealing from one another, and they looked after mates who were sick, injured, or sacked. They laid down many of the unspoken conventions of New Zealand male culture in the 20th and 21st century. To redress the sex imbalance, the Vogel government offered free passages to British single women. Most of those who came were attracted by the prospect of domestic work at a higher wage than that available at home, and by the prospect of eventual marriage and escape from drudgery, or rather, escape to drudgery on behalf of one's own family rather than somebody else's. Many failed to achieve that escape, but by 1891 the adult sex ratio was considerably more even, 56% male to 44% female. By this time, 58% of men over 20 were married and 77% of women. As a consequence of the immigration influx, the non-Maori population of New Zealand had soared to more than 470,000 by 1881. By that year, too, the Maori population had dropped to 46,000, and it would continue to decline as a result of disease and low fertility for most of the next 2 decades. Immigration peaked in 1874 when there were 34,000 assisted migrants, a number that has never since been exceeded. In the mid-1880s, however, those who were New Zealand-born became the majority of the population, and from that time population growth would result more from natural increase than from immigration. As an integral part of the Vogel program, transport and communications in New Zealand were revolutionized in the 1870s and 1880s. A telegraph cable had been laid between the North and South Islands in 1866. 10 years later, a further line connected New Zealand to Australia, and from there to the wider world. Extensions of road and rail carried out as part of the Public Works program sped up travel within the country and helped wheat growers get their grain to markets within the country and to ports for export. In 1874, over 28,000 hectares of the Canterbury Plains was given over to growing wheat. By 1884, that area had jumped to more than 100,000 hectares, and oats and wheat made up almost 20% of New Zealand's exports. That proportion dropped as prices declined and frozen meat was developed, but there was another peak of demand and supply in the early 1900s. The introduction of steamships over this period and their connection with rail links also sped up travel and mail within the country and to and from overseas destinations. In 1859, the fastest journey possible from Dunedin to Auckland took 15 days. By 1879, that had been reduced to 5.5 days, and by 1898, 3 days. Telephone networks, too, were established and spreading up from the urban centres from the early 1880s. All these innovations enabled the colony's widely scattered settlements to communicate better with one another and with the world beyond New Zealand. They were part of the process of creating a single society, or at least a single Pākehā society, and because they allowed more effective centralised administration, they were a factor in the abandonment of provincial government in 1875. The year after that constitutional milestone was achieved, Julius Vogel resigned from Parliament to take up the post of New Zealand Agent General in London. He would return to the country and to Parliament in 1884, however. He hoped that the job would allow him to pursue personal business interests and thus to strengthen his own financial position. He was replaced as Premier by a man who could not have been more different in temperament and appearance, the austere, straight-talking farmer Harry Atkinson. Atkinson, part of a tight network of pioneer Taranaki families that included the Richmonds and Hursthouses, had fought in the wars of the 1860s and become a strong advocate of suffocating any Maori resistance to the authority of the Crown. According to his biographer, Judith Bassett, he thought that the indigenous population should be utterly suppressed and eventually assimilated by the superior British. If this could be achieved by intimidation, that would be preferable to fighting. There was no suggestion that the Treaty of Waitangi might have any bearing on this. In national politics, which he had first entered in 1861, Atkinson was a centralist in opposition to the provincialists, and it was largely on this issue that he had joined forces with Vogel. He was relentlessly critical of the provincial councils, reckless borrowing and refusal to cooperate either with central government or with one another. After they were abolished in 1876, it was left to Atkinson and his ministry to oversee their replacement with a local government system of boroughs and counties. He intended, wrote Judith Bassett, that central government would have sole responsibility for borrowing money, but that localities would decide how and where it should be spent. He hoped that the new system would result in an even application of the colony's revenues to people's needs. He was a far more cautious borrower than Vogel, believing that there must be no doubt about a government's ultimate ability to service and pay back loans. As the country drifted into depression, he became even more cautious, not only about borrowing, but about public expenditure in general. One of the functions of provincial governments, which they had fulfilled with varying degrees of conscientiousness, was the provision and support of schools. Abolition meant that this responsibility had to be taken over by central government. The new arrangements were set out in the 1877 Education Act, prepared by the Atkinson Ministry and put into effect by the Grey Ministry which succeeded it. This provided for free, secular and compulsory primary education throughout the country. There was to be a 3-tiered system of administration. At the top was a new department and a Minister of Education, the first of whom was John Ballance, who 15 years later would become the first Liberal Premier. Below that were district education boards, which largely corresponded to those that existed under the provincial system. At the grassroots were school committees elected by local householders and responsible for management of schools in their own communities. This last element was the weakest in the system, particularly in rural areas where communities were often scattered and communication still primitive. Secondary education, which would not be free until the election of the first Labour government in the 1930s, was provided by high schools established under separate Acts of Parliament. Maori children could, if they or their parents so wished, attend local board schools, but they were already catered for by the 1867 Native Schools Act, which enabled primary schools to be established at the request of Maori communities under the supervision of the Native Department. At the specific request of Maori parents, the medium of instruction in these schools was to be English. Most of those parents who expressed a view on this issue in the 1860s thought that Maori was best learnt at home and English in the schools, to give pupils access to a wider world of knowledge. This policy was sometimes taken to extremes in the years that followed, with many children reporting that they had been punished for speaking Maori within school boundaries. The Atkinson premierships, 5 of them between 1876 and 1891, coincided with what came to be called the Long Depression. It began with falling wool prices in 1877 and merged into a period of worldwide recession in which the New Zealand economy did not grow for around 16 years. It led to regional unemployment, a deterioration in working conditions, and a tendency among urban employers to take on women and children rather than men so that they could be paid at lower rates. Atkinson, as colonial treasurer for 10 of the Depression years, refused to countenance Vogel-type responses. As Judith Bassett writes, he saw hard work, thrift and moderation as the keys to eventual recovery. This was hardly a message calculated to enthuse Parliament or the wider electorate, but Atkinson continued to move into and out of office as politicians with more radical proposals, such as George Grey, were tried and in their turn found wanting. Former Governor Grey became Premier in 1877. He had entered Parliament 2 years earlier while holding office as Superintendent of Auckland Province. One of his aims in entering national politics was to save the provincial system, but in this he failed. When Atkinson lost the confidence of the House on unrelated issues, Grey took office with a mixed cabinet of Conservatives and Liberals, the latter including Robert Stout and John Ballance, both identified early in their political careers as likely premiers of the future. Parliament turned to the by then 65-year-old statesman because of the residual mana and charisma of good Governor Grey, but his premiership was not a success. The former proconsul found the transition to politician difficult. Grey was not accustomed to being challenged. He was also by this time autocratic and cantankerous, and prone to riding off on hobby horses of his own. He became extremely hostile towards the operations of a speculative land enterprise called the New Zealand Agricultural Company, in which 2 of his ministers, Stout and Larnock, were involved. Eventually the government lost the 1879 election, in part because of the persistent effects of the Depression. Grey remained in Parliament as a backbencher until 1894, though his interests were by then focused more closely on his home on Kauo Island, and on the enormous range of plants and animals he had acclimatized to living there, including wallabies and kookaburras, which were still established in the region more than a century later. He was also much taken up with his scholarly pursuits, which had included correspondence with a range of scientific pioneers, such as Charles Darwin and T.H. Huxley. Grey's last service to his adopted country was as one of 3 New Zealand representatives at the Australian Federation Convention in Sydney in 1891, at which he opposed New Zealand's joining the Federation, a position supported by the New Zealand Parliament. He died in a London hotel in 1898, a year after reconciling with his long-separated wife, Eliza. The Long Depression continued to blight the prospects and shorten the lives of the 7 ministries which held office through the 1880s. Among the consequences outside Parliament, Raewyn Dalziel identified unemployment, poverty, the exploitation of women workers, ragged children in the streets, threadbare men on the tramp, damp, dark cottages in mean alleys. In addition, urban growth made social differences more noticeable. More women joined the workforce in this decade in an effort to contribute more to family incomes. But, as Keith Sinclair noted, the conditions of urban workers steadily deteriorated. Labour was so cheap that secondary industry was actually expanding, and the country was able to export small quantities of its manufactures. In 1888, respectable citizens were shocked to learn from a sermon on the sin of cheapness, delivered by a Presbyterian minister in Dunedin, that sweated labour existed in the clothing industry. A great many people found it intolerable that such an evil, which they believed to have been left behind by the immigrant ships, should so soon be reproduced in this young fair land. A royal commission in 1890 reported long work hours, poor pay, and in particular the exploitation of women and children. The shocked response to this report was one of the factors that boosted the Liberal Party's election campaign in that year. Even as economic conditions appeared least promising, however, developments in technology were laying foundations for future prosperity from a source previously undreamed of, refrigeration. In February 1882, the steamship Dunedin sailed from Port Chalmers with a cargo of 4,460 frozen mutton and 449 frozen lamb carcasses from the Totara estate near Oamaru. The vessel reached London 3 months later with the meat in perfect condition. For New Zealand, the world was suddenly a less frightening place than it had been, though this perception would take time to filter through society at large. The breakthrough meant that the country had a major new export commodity in addition to wool and grain, and by 1890 it was worth £1 million a year, nearly a quarter of the value of wool exports. By 1910 that figure had jumped to £3.8 million, nearly half the value of wool. This new option radically changed the nature of farming in New Zealand. Previously, sheep farmers had been forced to slaughter animals, sometimes by simply driving them over cliffs. Now they could raise sheep for meat and wool, which made smaller farms considerably more viable than they had been. It also resulted in a move away from merinos, useful only for their wool, and towards such breeds as Romney, which provided both commodities. The need to slaughter and prepare animals for export and for wider domestic distribution created the country's first large-scale industrial plants, freezing works, which also processed byproducts such as skins, tallow and manure. The new trade revived ports in smaller centres such as Bluff, Oamaru, Timaru, Gisborne and Napier. Refrigeration also allowed the export of butter and cheese, previously produced only for local consumption. This sector was slower to gather momentum than the meat industry because sheep could be produced on existing farms, whereas land for dairying had to be cleared and broken in over many parts of the country, especially in the Auckland provincial region, which had been focused for so long on extractive industries such as timber, gold and kauri gum. Parts of Southland were able to convert to dairy farming immediately, and the country's first dairy factory opened in Edendale in 1882. As other districts caught up, Taranaki and Waikato joined Southland as the major producers of butter and cheese. The export value of these products began to rise sharply in the early 1900s, reaching nearly 45% of the country's total exports by the early 1920s. As with meat, almost all this produce went to Britain, and New Zealand was well on the way to acquiring its identity as the dairy farm of the empire. It is difficult to see how New Zealand could have survived as a viable country had it had to continue to rely solely on wool and grain and extractive commodities for its national income. Wool and grain production could have been sustained, though competition from Australia would have increased. Timber would soon have been exhausted, as it was being harvested unsustainably, and the end of kauri milling was already in sight by early in the 20th century. The demand and price for gold and kauri gum were unstable, and New Zealand's reserves of the former were limited, and the market for the latter would disappear altogether as synthetics became available for the production of varnishes and linoleum. Rather than the countries being forced to wrestle with these considerations, however, the coincidence of refrigeration technology and a guaranteed market in Britain would soon deliver to New Zealanders one of the highest living standards in the world. It was a fortunate outcome, though one that would generate a new set of problems when questions eventually had to be asked about whether the extent and scale of grass farming that New Zealand had opted for was in fact sustainable in the light of the country's soils, climate and land instability. The 1880s, as well as being the period when major adjustments began to be made to the pattern of farming activities, was the first decade in which the three major issues which had preoccupied early colonial politics were absent. The country by this time had representative and responsible government. The years of overt Maori-Pākehā conflict were over, and British sovereignty, now meaning the authority of the colonial government, was a reality throughout the land, and the struggle between central government and the provinces had been resolved in favour of the centralists. Coalitions in Parliament could now form around the social and economic issues that engaged Pākehā New Zealand society as a whole. By 1890, the more radical MPs, who sought labour and industrial reforms, better conditions for urban working families, and the breaking up of big estates to give small farmers a chance to participate in the country's agricultural sectors, had formed themselves into the Liberal Party under the leadership of John Ballance. They would be the first group in the country's history to go into an election campaign held at the end of 1890 with a programme that a wide slate of candidates was pledged to support. The effects of this introduction into New Zealand of the kind of party politics that had already emerged in democracies in other parts of the world would be revolutionary and wide-ranging.